Hello, my name is Isidora Stojanovic, and today I will be talking about pejoratives. The material that I will present today is largely based on a joint paper with Bianca Cepolaro and Filippo Domaneschi entitled When is it okay to call someone a jerk? An experimental investigation of expressives, and published earlier this year in Synthese. Let me start by giving you an overview of the motivations and aims of our work. Consider an utterance such as, that bastard Connor got promoted. Bastard and similar expressions like jerk, asshole are what we call pejoratives. Most existing accounts of pejoratives predict that utterances such as this one, that the use of pejoratives in such utterances is felicitous and acceptable if the speaker has a negative attitude toward the person referred to, so in this example, Connor, and that this should be so regardless of whether this is known to the audience or whether the audience has also a negative attitude towards this person or whatever else may be the case in the common ground of the context. So what we have tried to do is test whether this prediction is empirically satisfied, and we have conducted an experimental study which ends up challenging this widely shared assumption. So what we think our study shows is that pejoratives impose certain interesting constraints on the context of use. So what I want to do in this talk today is present the study and discuss its implications as well as some further issues raised by pejoratives. Here is a plan for this talk. I'll start with some preliminaries, one regarding taxonomy, another regarding the projective behavior of pejoratives. I'll give an overview of the existing accounts of pejoratives, and then distinguish between referential and predicative uses of pejoratives. Then we will see three hypotheses about the felicity or the acceptability of uses of pejoratives. I will then present our study, present its result, and discuss what they show with respect to the various hypotheses that we have on the use of pejoratives. And in the last part of the talk, I will tell you about the follow-up study that we ran and discuss some further issues. Let me start by some taxonomy. There is unfortunately no consensus on the use of various terms. This talk is going to focus on words like bastard, asshole, jerk, or because our study is on Italian, the pejorative stronzo, that's an equivalent of jerk. I'll be calling those pejoratives. They're also sometimes called epithets or insults, and they're to be sharply distinguished from another type of derogatory expression that has received a lot of interest in the recent literature in philosophy, namely slurs. Slurs, racial and ethnic slurs. So frog is a slur, for example, for French. The N-word is a very offensive slur. There are slurs for sexual orientation and so on. So what distinguishes these two types of expressions is that pejoratives, they derogate only the person for whom they are used on a given occasion, whereas slurs are in a certain sense much more derogatory, because by using a slur for a person on a given occasion, the speaker and the use of the slur derogates the whole community that is to which the person belongs. So in the case of racial slurs, it is the whole race or sexual orientation and so on. So let me note that this is not necessarily a very neat division. It's an important division because we have two types of paradigmatic expressions on the two sides, but expressions such as bitch could be seen both as pejoratives, as an equivalent of, bastard or jerk, but it has been also shown that this expression can be seen as a gender slur derogating women in general. Now, it's not going to be important for this talk that we have a neat division. We are really going to focus just on the paradigmatic examples of pejoratives. Both slurs and pejoratives, they belong among derogatory expressions, and derogatory expressions can include further expressions which are not necessarily pejoratives of slurs, so shithole would be an example. Both slurs and pejoratives belong among expressives, occasionally I'll be using the word expressive to refer to pejoratives. So why have pejoratives been of interest to linguists? Because of their projective behavior. So if you look at sentences 1 to 5, I'm going to read them quickly. It's not true that that bastard Connor got promoted. Did that bastard Connor get promoted? If that bastard Connor gets promoted, then Shelley will resign. Jim thinks that that bastard Connor got promoted. Someone has told me that the bastard Connor got promoted. So in all these sentences, the pejorative occurs in environments that are entailment cancelling. So if there is an expression in such an environment, what it entails is not entailed by the whole sentence. The expression occurs embedded under operators such as the negation, or in 4 and 5 we have doxastic operators, things that, and we have speech reports like told me that. But what is interesting is that the derogatory content towards Connor in all 5 sentences is still conveyed by those sentences, even though the expression occurs in such environments. So to use a linguistic jargon, the derogatory content of pejoratives systematically projects, and as we see in 4 and 5, so those are environments such that very often a presupposition is cancelled in those environments, but we see that with pejoratives they seem to, as we say, hyper-project. So if you say Jim thinks that that bastard Connor got promoted, the derogatory attitude towards Connor is not confined to what Jim thinks. It seems to go beyond and to be part of what you communicate by uttering form. So I will not be talking much about the projective behavior of pejoratives in this talk, but it is important to have in mind that this is probably the feature that in the beginning got a lot of triggered a lot of interest in those expressions, and that can be relevant to some of the things that we are going to see later on. Let me now just briefly sketch the existing accounts of pejoratives. There has been some discussion. There was a preliminary discussion of those in David Kaplan's published monograph. It's just a manuscript on oops and ouch in 1999, but it's we can't really speak of a semantic account of pejoratives there. It is in the following years that we get proposals, properly semantic proposals on how to treat pejoratives. So Christopher Potts' influential book from 2005 takes pejoratives to be triggers of conventional implicatures, so that when you have use of a pejorative such as that bastard Connor, what happens there is that such an utterance will trigger a conventional implicature to the effect that the speaker holds the referent in low opinion, or has a negative attitude toward the referent. There is a relatively similar account put forward by Giuseppe Massia in a paper from 2002, though the paper is in Spanish, so that may explain why it may not have been so influential. And then Philippe Schlenker's paper from 2007 on expressive presuppositions. So their account is in a way similar to Pott's, but what they claim is that it is not a conventional implicature, rather it's a presupposition that pejoratives trigger. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with conventional implicatures and presuppositions, there are some tests which are meant to distinguish these kind of mechanisms, but for our purposes today, the difference between the two is not particularly important. What we should keep in mind simply is that on Messiaen and Schlenker account, pejoratives trigger the presupposition that the speaker holds Conner-in-law opinion. And then there is an account from 2013 from Judith Tonhauser, David Beaver, Craigie Roberts, and Mandy Simons. So it's a paper which is not specifically about pejoratives. Their paper challenges the distinction between conventional implicatures and presuppositions and proposes a new taxonomy of projective content. Still, what they claim is that pejoratives they lack certain features which sometimes we see with presuppositions and conventional implicatures. Well, actually, much more with presuppositions, and that is the so-called strong contextual felicity constraint. So the idea is that there are expressions which have this feature, and basically such expressions cannot be felicitously used in a context when there is not a certain constraint on the common ground of the context, and other expressions which can be felicitously used without any such constraint. And so basically what Tonhauser and her colleagues propose is that, well, what they claim is that pejoratives can be felicitously used without any special constraints on the context of use. So this is this survey is extremely rough, but it is going to be enough for our purposes. The last thing to note in the preliminaries is that, as we've just seen, the existing account of pejoratives almost exclusively focus on what we can call referential uses of pejoratives. So uses where you have a term like bastard or jerk in an expression that is meant to refer to a particular person. So that bastard, the jerk, and so on. And this use can be contrasted with what we call predicative use, where we have something like Connor is a jerk. And this is also an interesting thing to note, because when you look at the literature on slurs, so the other type of derogatory expressions, there a lot of discussion really goes on predicative uses. So it is interesting that the predicative uses of pejoratives have not received much, if any, attention at all in the literature. So we did also look at those predicative uses, as we are going to see shortly. At any rate, so the distinction to retain is between pejorative used in a referential expression and it's being used in a predicative expression. So ref and pred are abbreviations that I'm going to adopt for the distinction. Let's move on to our study. So we can formulate three hypotheses on the acceptability of pejoratives. The first one is, so the three hypotheses will be replicated for referential and predicative uses. In the case of referential uses, the first hypothesis says that an utterance such as that bastard Connor got promoted, where we have a referential use of bastard, is acceptable both in neutral and satisfying contexts, where this difference between neutral and satisfying contexts will be clarified in a second. The second hypothesis is that it is acceptable in satisfying but not in neutral context. And the third is that it is never acceptable. And similarly, for an utterance such as Connor is a jerk, H1 star says that it is acceptable both in neutral and satisfying context. H2 star that it is acceptable in satisfying but not in neutral context, and then H3 star that it is never acceptable. So let me start by clarifying this difference between satisfying and neutral context. We say that the context is satisfying, or also that it is a positive context. I will be using terms satisfying and positive interchangeably. When given an expression that has a certain context C, the context or what is known in this context, the information in the common ground, entails C. So in other words, a context is positive or satisfying when it is already part of the information known in this context that C is the case. And we say that the context is neutral if this information neither entails C nor does it entail not C. Okay, so the three accounts of pejoratives that we've seen earlier, namely the conventional implicature account, the presupposition account, and then the Tannhauser and her colleagues' account, which says that pejoratives don't impose a strong contextual felicity constraint. So all three accounts clearly predict H1, namely the hypothesis that use of pejoratives should be felicitous or acceptable, both in satisfying and neutral accounts. Now, acceptability, we take that to be a pre-theoretical concept, and there is, of course, more than one understanding of what is acceptable. Something can be acceptable from a linguistic point of view, but not from, say, a social point of view. So what we hope to track with the notion of acceptability in the study is linguistic acceptability, or what can also be referred to as felicity. And note that this is something that comes in degrees. Some things may be more acceptable than others, so it's not an all or nothing um, property or notion. So we still want to talk about something being acceptable or not acceptable, and what we implicitly understand is that when we say that the use of an expression is acceptable, that it is so over a certain contextually specified threshold. And similarly, when we say that something is not acceptable, we mean that it is below a threshold for what is acceptable in a given context. So I think this will become more clear as we go on. Now let me move on to the study that we ran, and as I mentioned, so with my colleagues Bianca Cepolaro and Filippo Domaneschi, we ran a study on the Italian pejorative stronzo, which is an equivalent of jerk. It was an online study with 90 participants. They were all students, and the stimuli they were formed of a context scenario, which is a description of a context, and a series of 12 sentences. Of these 12 sentences, only one sentence was a target, and the other 11 were fillers or distractors. And we had 4 types of target sentences and 2 types of context scenarios. So the target sentences could contain a pejorative or a controller in either a referential or a predicative use, and then the context scenarios could be either satisfying or neutral. So in other words, it was an experimental design of 4x2, and it was run within subjects. So the variations were whether in the stimulus the context was one that was satisfying or neutral, and then whether the target sentence contained a pejorative or a controller, and whether this expression was in a predicative or referential use. So in this table, by simply putting pej or con, that is to be taken as pejorative in predicative use or controller in predicative use, whereas that pej and that con is that pejoratives is part of complex demonstratives such as that jerk blah, or that the controller is part of such a context of such a complex demonstrative. So to make things uh, uh, more smooth, let me give the examples of the sentences that we used. So pej would be something like Marco è stronzo, Marco is a jerk. That pej is quello stronzo di Marco è arrivato, that jerk Marco has arrived. And then a controller would be something like Marco è siciliano, Marco è Sicilian, whereas the that controller is quel siciliano di Marco è arrivato, that Sicilian Marco has arrived. So now let me give an example of the context scenarios that we used in our stimuli. So as I mentioned, they could be either satisfying or positive or neutral. And the difference was just in one sentence. So here is an example of a positive context. I will read directly the translation in English. So Sarah and Luca are at the graduation party. The host has invited Marco. Nobody stands him because of his arrogance. When Marco arrives at the party, Luca says to Sarah. And a neutral context would be exactly like that, without this sentence that we saw in blue, which makes it explicit that Marco is, so to speak, a bad person, or has done something bad, or in other words, deserves to be held in low opinion. So controller sentences were of a similar structure. So Sarah and Luca are at the graduation party. The host has invited Marco. Marco is Sicilian, and he brought a dessert typical of his place. When Marco arrives at the party, Luca says to Sarah. And then the target sentence would be, as mentioned, either in a referential or a predicative use, so something like Marco is Sicilian, or that Sicilian Marco has arrived. Again, for controller sentences, the neutral context is as a previous one, except that what we had in blue, which simply states the information that, say, Marco is Sicilian, is missing. So the procedure of the study was that the participants would read the description of the context, so this scenario, this 2 or 3 sentences, and then they would have 12 sentences for which they would rate their acceptability on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. Now remember that of the 12 sentences, only 1 was what we were interested in, namely the target, and then 11 were distractors. So by way of recap, the study had a 2 by 2 by 2 variation, whether the context was satisfying or neutral, whether the expression that we had was a pejorative or a controller, and the controllers were expressions such as Sicilian, but also early riser and similar expressions of professions and so on. And then the third variation was referential versus predicative uses. So I'm moving now to results. If there are unclarities about the tasks and the study itself, it can of course be resolved during the question and answers period. But let me show what our study basically established. So this is what we got, and I am going to go step by step as to the different things that we have obtained with this study, that we see in this study. So on this graph, the red is for the pejoratives, for sentences containing stronzo, and the gray is for the controllers. And then we have the four the four cases are a positive predicative, neutral predicative, and then positive referential, neutral referential. So here is the first thing that we observed with the results, namely that the sentences with pejoratives are overall less acceptable than the sentences with controllers, except in one condition, namely that where we had a satisfying context or a positive context, and both the pejorative and the controller were used as part of a complex demonstrative, such as that jerk Marco or that Sicilian Marco. So in that condition, we see no difference. So that is the third that you have. But all the three others, the one that I've highlighted with red rectangles, are such that that in them we see a difference in acceptability. Now, what is probably the most important result of our study, and the one that we think really addresses the three hypotheses on the use, is are the differences in acceptability that we see when we look at neutral context. So those are the two that we have now highlighted in red. As we're going to see in a short while, when we move from a positive to a neutral context, there is going to be a certain drop in acceptability, both for pejoratives and for their controllers. But what happens with pejoratives is that this acceptability drops, we could even say dramatically. So there is really a huge difference in the acceptability, depending on whether we are in positive, that is satisfying context, or in a neutral context. And we see that whereas with controllers, they are slightly less acceptable than in positive context, the pejoratives in a neutral context have really low acceptability. They still are judged acceptable, but only to a more or less 2 points on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. The third result worth stressing is that when we look at controllers in neutral context, the referential uses of controllers are judged less acceptable than the predicative uses. So if you have a context that doesn't specify anything about where Marco comes from, and you have something like that Sicilian Marco has arrived, that is judged less acceptable than saying that Marco is Sicilian. And so there is another interesting result that we see in our study is that when you look at positive context and at pejoratives there, both in predicative and in referential uses, um, their acceptability is very high. It is slightly lower than the acceptability of controllers in predicative uses, but still, when you look at the graph, so I've again highlighted this with red rectangles. We see that the acceptability of pejoratives in positive context is approximately 4. They are perfectly acceptable, as you might say. And so this is a graph that shows the results slightly differently. They're the same results, but the different graph, where now the blue is used for the positive context and the gray for the neutral context. And so last result that we observe in the study is that overall, both for pejoratives and controllers, and both for predicative and referential uses, the acceptability diminishes when you move from a positive to a neutral context. And this is so even for controllers. So if you have so if you have a sentence like Marco is Sicilian, it is judged as more acceptable in a context where this is already known than the one where there is no information to that effect. Now, this is an effect which is not particularly, so this kind of observation is not particularly new with this study, and sometimes this is attributed to an effect of priming, but it is still something noteworthy. So now let us, okay, here we are. Apologies for the interruption. So let us go back to our three hypotheses. The first one, that a sentence containing a pejorative is acceptable both in neutral and satisfying context. So we have that as H1 and H1 star regarding both referential and predicative uses. H2, that it is acceptable in satisfying but not in neutral context, and H3, that it is never acceptable. So what we see in the results is that they speak in favor of H2, the hypothesis that pejoratives are acceptable in satisfying, but not so acceptable in neutral context. And they speak against H1 and H3. Now, we've seen that all sorts of expressions are less acceptable in neutral than in positive or satisfying context. We've seen that that's also the case for controllers. But what is particularly important to speak against H1 is that pejoratives are much less acceptable. So when you compare them to non-pejorative, and you see how their acceptability drops in neutral context, we see really a huge difference when it comes to pejoratives. And we take that to speak very strongly against H1, namely the hypothesis that is predicted by all the existing accounts of pejoratives, according to which we shouldn't really expect any such difference, and we should find the acceptability of pejoratives high in neutral context as well. Now, our results also show that in those cases, namely neutral context where pejoratives are not really acceptable, so this cannot be an effect of the fact that pejoratives are bad words, what you might call a taboo effect. Given that in a positive or satisfying context, pejoratives are perfectly acceptable. Actually, when you look at referential uses, pejoratives and their controllers are just equally acceptable. There is no difference whatsoever. Um, so this speaks against a hypothesis which would predict that pejoratives just shouldn't be acceptable at all. Now, it is true that in the literature there are no, to our knowledge, no accounts that give that prediction, but in the literature on slurs, there are influential accounts, the so-called prohibitionist accounts, such as Anderson and Lepore's, which predict, which if they were to be applied to pejoratives, would give that prediction. And what we see is that pejoratives are not taboo words. In satisfying context, they are perfectly fine. Now, we mentioned some further results. So we've seen that in neutral context, uh, the referential uses of controllers are less acceptable than their predicative uses. So we see a difference. It is not a huge difference, but it is a significant difference between the two conditions. And we think that there could be two explanations. One is simply that we have a neutral, that we have a complex demonstrative, and when we move to a neutral context, so this requires a presupposition accommodation. So remember, the example would be something like that Sicilian Marco has arrived in a context in which it is not known that Marco is Sicilian, so that would require accommodating the presupposition that Marco is Sicilian. And another possible explanation could be that when you use something like that Sicilian Marco, this is pragmatically marked and might trigger a derogatory interpretation. So this is a possibility that we would like to explore in some future works. And then let me mention one last further result, namely that with predicative uses of pejoratives, we also see that the acceptability drops when we move to a neutral context. So remember that the literature on pejoratives focuses on referential uses. We have looked at predicative uses, and so we have noticed this interesting fact that when you compare them to controllers, pejoratives are less acceptable in a neutral context in their predicative uses. So one hypothesis would be that this could be due simply to the fact that you're predicating or saying something negative about someone. Now, this is something that we did want to look into, and this invited a follow-up study that I'm going to present now in what follows. So what we wanted to do in this follow-up study is make sure that the pejorative, we wanted to see whether the drop in acceptability in pejoratives in their predicative uses could be due, as I've just said, to the fact that you're saying something negative, whereas with the other controllers, there is no such negative predication. So what we did is to compare pejoratives with negatively balanced words. And the study that we ran was again in Italian. It had 103 participants, again students, and the stimuli consisted similarly as in our first study of a context scenario and the target sentence. Now this study was much simpler because it only had two conditions. In the target sentence, there was the the pejorative or a negatively balanced word, and those included words like antipatico, which is nasty, cattivo, mean, maleducada, rude, sleale, disloyal, odiosa, hateful, insopportabile, unbearable, and so on. So again, the task was to rate the acceptability on a 1 to 5 scale. And what we had were 8 stories and 11 and 12 fillers. So here is an example of a stimulus in study 2, quite similar to the ones we used in our first study. Sarah and Luca are at the graduation party. The host has invited Marco. When Marco arrives at the party, Luca says to Sarah, so we have Marco Estronzo, the one that we had in our first study, or something like Marco è antipatico. So here are the results of this follow-up study. Again, it's a fairly simple study. And we see a significant difference in acceptability. We see that pejoratives are much less acceptable than other nouns that are negatively balanced. So what this suggests is that this effect of lower acceptability is not simply due to saying something negative, but has something to do with the fact that we have an expression of the type pejorative or an expressive, as you might say. So to sum up, the existing accounts of pejoratives predict, while they differ on some aspects, they converge on this prediction that when a speaker is using a term like that jerk, this should be acceptable in a context if the speaker holds the referent in low opinion, regardless of whether there is any background information about that or whether the other conversation participants share this attitude, or whether the referent deserves to be held in low opinion and referred to in such a way. And what we did with my colleagues Bianca Cepolaro and Filippo Domaneschi is run an experimental study which we claim this confirms this hypothesis and shows that the use of pejoratives is sensitive to contextual information to a much higher degree than other control items. We also see that what the study shows is that it's not just that pejoratives are bad words and in that respect unacceptable, because in appropriate context they're judged equally acceptable as other words, as their controllers. So this is how far we've got. We have some projects for further studies, namely to investigate the specific conditions that pejoratives impose on the constraints, but I leave this for discussion. Thank you so much for listening. Here are some selected references, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you again.